The morning sun was just peeking over the horizon when Elizabeth stepped off the train in Denver. Her hands were shaking, but not from the cold mountain air. After 3 days of traveling from Boston, she was finally close to her destination. Just one more stagecoach ride, and she would meet the man she was supposed to marry. Elizabeth had never imagined her life would take this turn. 6 months ago, she was living comfortably in her father's house in Boston, helping with his small bookkeeping business. But when her father passed away, suddenly, everything changed. The debts piled up faster than she could count them. The house had to be sold. Her options were simple: find a husband quickly or face a life of working in the textile mills. That's when her friend Clara showed her the advertisement in the newspaper. Successful rancher seeks educated woman for marriage. Must be of good character and willing to embrace frontier life. The man's name was Thomas, and his letters seemed kind enough. He promised a comfortable home, security, and respect. It wasn't love, but Elizabeth had given up on fairy tales long ago. Now, standing at the stagecoach station with her 2 small bags, Elizabeth wondered if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. The other passengers looked rough and weathered. She felt completely out of place in her best traveling dress, the one she had saved for meeting her future husband. The stagecoach driver, a gruff man with tobacco stains on his shirt, looked at her like she was crazy. "You sure you want to go to Cedar Creek territory, miss? It's rough country out there. Not exactly the kind of place for a lady like yourself." Elizabeth lifted her chin. "I'm sure, thank you." The journey started well enough. The other passengers mostly kept to themselves. There was an older woman traveling to visit her son, a businessman, heading to a mining town, and 2 cowboys who seemed more interested in sleeping than talking. Elizabeth spent most of the first day looking out the window, amazed by how different everything looked from Boston. The endless sky seemed to go on forever, and the mountains in the distance looked like something from a painting. But by the second day, the weather started changing. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and the wind picked up. The stagecoach rocked back and forth more violently, making Elizabeth feel sick to her stomach. She tried to focus on the book she had brought, but the constant bouncing made it impossible to read. "Looks like we're in for a storm," one of the cowboys said. Looking out at the sky with concern, the older woman clutched her bag tighter. "How much further to the next station?" "About 6 hours, if we're lucky," the driver called back from his seat. They weren't lucky. The storm hit them like a wall of water and wind. Rain poured through every crack in the stagecoach, soaking everyone. Inside, lightning flashed so bright it hurt to look at, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the ground. The horses were getting spooked, and Elizabeth could hear the driver shouting at them, trying to keep them calm. Then it happened. A lightning bolt struck a tree just ahead of them, and the massive trunk came crashing down across the road. The horses reared up in panic, and Elizabeth felt the stagecoach tipping to one side. She grabbed onto the seat, her heart pounding as they tilted further and further until finally, with a loud crack, one of the wheels broke completely. Everyone was thrown around inside the coach. Elizabeth hit her head against the window and felt a sharp pain shoot through her skull. When the chaos finally stopped, they were stuck at an awkward angle, rain still pouring in through the damaged roof. "Everyone all right in there?" The driver called out. Elizabeth touched her forehead and felt a small cut, but nothing serious. The other passengers seemed shaken but unhurt. The real problem was the stagecoach itself. Even Elizabeth, who knew nothing about vehicles, could see it wasn't going anywhere soon. "Wheels completely busted," the driver announced after checking the damage. "And that tree's blocking the road anyway. We're going to have to walk to the next town." "Walk?" The older woman looked terrified. "In this weather? How far is it?" "About 3 miles to Cedar Creek. There's a boarding house there where we can wait for help." Elizabeth's heart sank. Cedar Creek was supposed to be just a brief stop before continuing to Thomas's ranch. Now it looked like she might be stuck there for days, maybe longer. What would Thomas think when she didn't arrive on time? She had already sent him a letter with her expected arrival date. The walk to Cedar Creek was miserable. The rain had turned the dirt road into thick mud that stuck to their shoes and made every step difficult. Elizabeth's traveling dress, which had seemed so appropriate in Boston, was completely wrong for trudging through a storm. The heavy fabric soaked up water like a sponge, making it even harder to walk. By the time they reached the small settlement, Elizabeth was exhausted, soaked to the bone, and starting to feel dizzy. Cedar Creek wasn't much to look at, just a handful of wooden buildings, clustered around a main street that had turned into a river of mud. But the warm yellow light glowing from the windows of the boarding house looked like heaven to Elizabeth. Mrs. Patterson, the woman who ran the boarding house, took one look at the bedraggled group and ushered them inside immediately. "You poor souls, come in, come in. Let me get you some hot coffee and dry clothes." The boarding house was simple but clean, with a big fireplace in the main room and the wonderful smell of beef stew cooking somewhere in the back. Elizabeth felt a wave of relief wash over her as she stepped into the warmth, but the relief didn't last long. Within an hour, Elizabeth started feeling worse. Her head was pounding, not just from hitting it in the stagecoach, but from something deeper. Her body felt hot and cold at the same time, and every muscle ached like she had been working in the fields all day. "You don't look so good, dear," Mrs. Patterson said, studying Elizabeth's face with concern. "You're looking a bit flushed." Elizabeth tried to smile. "I'm just tired from the journey. I'm sure I'll feel better after a good night's sleep." But she didn't feel better. By morning, she could barely get out of bed. Her fever was so high that everything seemed blurry and far away. The other passengers had found a way to continue their journey, but Elizabeth was too sick to even stand up properly. Mrs. Patterson did her best to help, bringing cool cloths and soup, but she had her own family to care for. Her youngest child had been fighting a cough for weeks, and she was clearly overwhelmed. Elizabeth lay in the small upstairs room, burning with fever and wondering what was going to happen to her. She was supposed to be meeting Thomas in just 2 days. How could she explain that she was stuck in a tiny frontier town, too sick to travel? What kind of first impression would that make? As the fever got worse, Elizabeth started having strange dreams. Sometimes she thought she was back in Boston, helping her father with his books. Other times she dreamed she was lost in an endless storm, calling for help that never came. She would wake up confused and frightened, not sure where she was or what was happening to her. It was during one of these feverish nights that everything changed, though Elizabeth wouldn't understand how much until later. Downstairs in the boarding house, a quiet cowboy was asking Mrs. Patterson about the sick stranger upstairs. He had heard about her situation and felt something stirring in his heart, a desire to help that he couldn't quite explain. Jake had been staying at the boarding house for 3 days, waiting for the weather to clear before joining up with the cattle drive heading north. He was a man of simple needs and few words, content to spend his evenings by the fire, mending his gear and listening to the rain on the roof. But something about the sick woman upstairs had been bothering him since the night she arrived. He first heard about her from Mrs. Patterson during breakfast. The poor woman looked exhausted, running up and down the stairs with cool water and broth, trying to care for Elizabeth while also tending to her own sick child. "I just don't know what to do," Mrs. Patterson confided to Jake over coffee. "That poor girl is burning up with fever, and she keeps calling out for someone named Thomas. Must be her husband or sweetheart. But there's no way to get word to anyone. And I can barely keep up with everything." Jake stirred his coffee slowly, thinking. He had seen plenty of sick folks during his years on the trail. Fever could be dangerous, especially for someone as delicate as the young woman appeared to be. "What kind of help does she need?" he asked quietly. Mrs. Patterson wiped her hands on her apron. "Mainly just someone to sit with her, keep the fever down with cool cloths, try to get some water or broth into her when she's awake enough. But I can't be up there all the time with little Tommy coughing so bad." That evening, Jake made a decision that surprised even himself. He knocked gently on Mrs. Patterson's kitchen door and cleared his throat awkwardly. "Ma'am, I was thinking I don't have anywhere urgent to be for a few days. If you'd like, I could help sit with the sick lady. I've dealt with fever before." Mrs. Patterson looked at him with surprise and relief. Oh, Mr. Sullivan, that's very kind of you, but are you sure? It's not exactly. Well, it might not be proper for a young man to dot. I'll be respectful, ma'am. Just want to help. Seems like the Christian thing to do. And so began the strangest week of Jake's life. He moved a chair into the small room where Elizabeth lay tossing and turning with fever. Mrs. Patterson had given him clean cloths, a basin of cool water, and strict instructions about getting liquids into the patient whenever possible. The first night was the hardest. Elizabeth was completely lost in her fever, sometimes crying out in her sleep, other times lying so still that Jake would lean close just to make sure she was still breathing. He had never felt so helpless in his life. Out on the range, problems were usually things you could fix with your hands or solve with hard work, but fever was different. All he could do was keep changing the cool cloths on her forehead and hope for the best. Around midnight, Elizabeth started shivering violently. Despite the fever, Jake carefully pulled the blanket up around her shoulders, being careful not to wake her. In the dim candlelight, he could see how young she was, probably not much older than his own sister back home. Her dark hair was damp with sweat, and her face was flushed red from the fever. "Please don't let her die," he found himself whispering. Though he wasn't sure who he was talking to, the second day brought new challenges. Elizabeth woke up several times, but she was so confused by the fever that she didn't seem to understand where she was. Once she grabbed Jake's hand and started crying, saying something about being late and disappointing someone. Another time she tried to get out of bed, insisting she had to catch a stagecoach. "Easy there, miss," Jake said gently, helping her lie back down. "You're safe. You just need to rest and get better." "The Thomas," she whispered, her eyes unfocused. "He's waiting for me. I promised I'd be there." Jake felt a strange pang in his chest at the mention of this Thomas fellow. Probably her husband or the man she was traveling to marry. He pushed the feeling aside and focused on getting some water between her lips. By the third day, Jake had fallen into a routine. During the day, he would take breaks to help Mrs. Patterson with chores around the boarding house, checking on the horses and fixing things that needed repair. But every evening he would return to the chair beside Elizabeth's bed, reading aloud from a book of poetry he had found among her belongings. He had never been much for reading, but something about the words seemed to calm her when she was restless. His voice was rough and unpracticed, stumbling over the fancier words, but Elizabeth seemed to respond to the sound. Sometimes her breathing would slow and become more peaceful when he read. "Listen to this one," he said softly on the fourth night. Even though she appeared to be sleeping, "It's about home and traveling and such." He read slowly, pronouncing each word carefully. "The world is so wide, and I am so small, I do not like it at all, at all." Elizabeth's eyes fluttered open, more focused than they had been in days. That's Emily Dickinson," she whispered, her voice hoarse but clearer. Jake nearly dropped the book. "You're awake. How are you feeling?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of cattle," she said with a weak smile. "But better than yesterday, I think." "You've been reading to me?" "Yes, ma'am." "Hoped it might help somehow." Elizabeth studied his face in the candlelight. "Huh. You're not Thomas." "No, ma'am. Name's Jake Sullivan. I've been helping Mrs. Patterson take care of you." "How long have I been sick?" 4 days now. You had us pretty worried." Elizabeth tried to sit up but fell back against the pillow, still too weak. 4 days? Oh no, Thomas will think I've changed. My mind, he'll think I'm not coming. Jake helped her take a few sips of water. "This Thomas fellow, he's your husband?" "My intended husband. I was traveling to marry him when the stagecoach broke down." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "He's expecting me, and now I'm just stuck here." Something twisted in Jake's stomach, but he kept his voice steady. "Well, first thing is getting you better. Then we can worry about getting word to him." Over the next 2 days, Elizabeth's fever finally broke completely. She was weak but clear-headed, and Jake found himself looking forward to their conversations more than he cared to admit. She was unlike any woman he had ever met, educated, well-spoken, but not in a way that made him feel stupid or small. She told him about her life in Boston, about her father's business and the books she loved to read. Jake found himself sharing stories about life on the cattle drives, about the vast open spaces and the simple satisfaction of honest work. Elizabeth listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed she was really paying attention. "It sounds wonderful," she said one evening as Jake described watching the sunrise over the plains. "So much freedom. It's a hard life," Jake replied honestly. "Not much comfort or security in it." "But you choose it," Elizabeth said thoughtfully. "That must count for something." Jake had never thought about it that way before. Most people saw his life as something you did when you couldn't do anything better. But Elizabeth seemed to understand that there was value in choosing your own path, even if it wasn't the easiest one. On the seventh night, as Elizabeth slept peacefully for the first time since her fever started, Jake sat in his chair and realized something that scared him more than any storm or wild animal ever had. Somewhere during those long nights of caring for her, listening to her laugh and talk about her dreams, he had fallen completely in love with a woman who belonged to someone else. The morning Elizabeth woke up feeling truly herself again, she noticed things she had been too sick to see before. The room was clean and organized, with fresh flowers in a jar by the window. Her clothes had been washed and mended. Someone had even polished her muddy boots until they shined. But what caught her attention most was the man sleeping in the chair beside her bed. Jake was slumped forward, his chin resting on his chest, breathing deeply. Even in sleep he looked tired. Elizabeth realized he must have been watching over her for days without proper rest. She studied his face in the morning light streaming through the window. His skin was weathered from years working outdoors, and his hands, folded in his lap, were rough and scarred from hard work. Everything about him was different from the men she had known in Boston. Yet there was something peaceful about his presence that made her feel safer than she had in months. Jake stirred and opened his eyes, immediately sitting up straight when he saw she was awake. "Morning, miss. How are you feeling?" "Much better. Thank you." Elizabeth's voice was still weak but clear. "And please call me Elizabeth. I think after everything you've done, we can skip the formalities." A shy smile crossed Jake's face. "Elizabeth, that's a pretty name. How long have you been sitting in that chair?" "Just since last night," Jake said, though Elizabeth suspected it had been much longer. Mrs. Patterson needed to tend to her own. "Boy, he's been running a fever too." Elizabeth felt a stab of guilt. Here she was, a complete stranger, and this man had been sacrificing his sleep to care for her while Mrs. Patterson's own child was sick. "You should be resting. You look exhausted." "I'm fine. Used to staying up all night during cattle drives." Anyway, Jake stood and stretched, his joints creaking. "Are you hungry?" Mrs. Patterson made some fresh bread this morning. For the first time in a week, Elizabeth actually felt like eating. Jake helped her sit up properly and brought her a tray with bread, butter, and hot tea. As she ate, they talked quietly about simple things: the weather, the other people staying at the boarding house, Jake's plans to rejoin the cattle drive. "Why did you help me?" Elizabeth asked suddenly. "You don't even know me." Jake was quiet for a moment, looking out the window. "My sister got sick like this once when I was just a kid. Whole family was in a panic, didn't know what to do. A neighbor woman, old Mrs. Henderson, she came and sat with my sister for 3 days straight. Never asked for anything in return. Just said it was what people should do for each other." He turned back to Elizabeth. "My sister got better. Mrs. Henderson said the fever broke because someone was there, talking to her, keeping her spirit up. Figured maybe you needed the same thing." Elizabeth felt tears spring to her eyes. In all her years in Boston society, she had never met someone who would sacrifice so much for a stranger based on simple human kindness. Over the next few days, as Elizabeth grew stronger, she and Jake spent more time talking. She was fascinated by his stories of life on the open range. He told her about cattle drives that lasted for months, about sleeping under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, about the satisfaction of bringing a herd safely to market after weeks of hard travel. "Aren't you ever lonely?" Elizabeth asked one afternoon as they sat on the boarding house porch. She was finally strong enough to walk around a little, though she still tired easily. Sometimes, Jake admitted. But there's something about all that open space that makes you feel, I don't know, like you're part of something bigger. Hard to explain to someone who hasn't seen it, Elizabeth nodded thoughtfully. In Boston, I always felt so closed in. Even in the biggest house, with all the nice things, it felt like the walls were pressing in on me. Like I was living someone else's life. What do you mean? Elizabeth hesitated, then decided to be honest. I'm traveling to marry a man I've never met. After my father died, I had no choice. It was either find a husband quickly or end up working in the factories. Thomas seems like a good man from his letters, but ... she trailed off. But you don't love him, Jake said quietly. I don't even know him. How can you love someone you've never spent time with? Elizabeth looked down at her. Hands. But love seems like a luxury I can't afford. Thomas can provide security, a home, respectability. That should be enough. Jake was silent for a long time. Elizabeth glanced at him and saw he was struggling with something, his jaw tight. What if it's not enough? He asked finally. What do? You mean? What if you're miserable? What if you spend the rest of your life wishing you had made a different choice? Elizabeth had been asking herself the same question for weeks, but hearing it from Jake made it feel more real somehow. Then I suppose I'll learn to live with it. Women don't have as many choices as men do. Maybe not in Boston, Jake said. But out here, things are different. People make their own rules more. That evening, Jake taught Elizabeth how to play cards. With a worn deck he carried in his saddlebags. She was terrible at it, which made them both laugh. Jake was patient, explaining the rules over and over, and Elizabeth found herself enjoying the simple pleasure of his company more than any fancy party she had ever attended in Boston. You're cheating, she accused when Jake won the fifth hand in a row. I'm not. You're just not paying attention to what cards have been played. It's too hard to keep track of everything. Jake grinned. You'll get it. Just takes practice. As they played, Elizabeth found herself watching Jake's hands as he dealt the cards. They were gentle despite their roughness, and she noticed how careful he was with everything he touched. When he handed her the cards, his fingers would sometimes brush against hers, sending a little shock through her that she tried to ignore. Jake? She said during a break between hands. What will you do when the cattle drive ends? Find another one, I suppose. Or maybe work a ranch for the winter. Haven't thought much beyond that. Don't you ever want to settle down? Have a home of your own? Jake's expression grew wistful. Sometimes I think about it. Having a little place, maybe raising some horses. But it takes money to buy land, and I've never been much good at saving. Seems like something's always coming up that needs the money more. Elizabeth studied his face. You'd be good at it. You're kind and responsible, and you work hard. Any woman would be lucky to... She stopped herself, realizing what she was about to say. A flush crept up her cheeks. Jake looked at her intently. Any woman would be what? I just meant ... You'd make a good husband someday. For the right person. The air between them seemed to change, becoming charged with something neither of them wanted to name. Jake reached across the small table and gently touched Elizabeth's hand. Elizabeth, I need to tell you something. Before he could continue, Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway. Miss Elizabeth, there's a man here asking about you, says his name is Thomas Whitman, and he's come to collect his bride. Elizabeth's heart stopped. Thomas was here, a week early, and she wasn't ready. She looked at Jake and saw something break in his eyes as he quickly pulled his hand away from hers. I'll leave you to speak with him, Jake said quietly, standing up. I should probably check on my horse anyway. As Jake walked away, Elizabeth felt like something precious was slipping through her fingers. But Thomas was waiting, and she had a duty to fulfill, no matter what her heart was telling her. Elizabeth's hands shook as she smoothed down her dress and checked her reflection in the small mirror. After a week of being sick, she knew she didn't look her best, but there was nothing to be done about it now. Thomas was downstairs waiting, and she had kept him long enough. She could hear voices from the main room below. Mrs. Patterson's cheerful chatter and a deeper, unfamiliar voice responding politely but briefly. That had to be Thomas. Elizabeth took a deep breath and made her way downstairs. Each step feeling heavier than the last. The man standing by the fireplace was exactly what she had expected from his letters. Thomas Whitman was tall and well-dressed, with carefully groomed hair and an expensive-looking coat. He had the bearing of someone used to being in charge, and when he turned to look at her, his eyes quickly assessed her from head to toe like he was evaluating livestock. "Elizabeth," he said, moving forward with a practiced smile, "at last we meet. Though I must say you look rather pale. I hope your illness wasn't serious." "I'm much better now, thank you." Elizabeth accepted his offered hand, noticing how soft it was compared to Jake's work-roughened fingers. "I'm sorry I wasn't able to arrive on schedule. The stagecoach accident. And then falling sick. It wasn't how I planned to start our acquaintance." Thomas waved dismissively. "These things happen on the frontier. Fortunately, I was able to come collect you personally rather than sending my men. We can be back to the ranch by evening if we leave within the hour." "Within the hour?" Elizabeth felt a flutter of panic. She had hoped for at least a day to prepare herself mentally for this transition. "I haven't had time to properly pack or say goodbye to ... How much could you possibly have? I've brought proper clothing for a rancher's wife back at the house. As for goodbyes, surely you haven't formed attachments to strangers in a week." Elizabeth felt a chill at his dismissive tone, but she forced herself to smile. This was what she had come for, after all: security, stability, a new life. Romance was a luxury she couldn't afford. While Thomas discussed travel arrangements with Mrs. Patterson, Elizabeth slipped outside to look for Jake. She found him by the stables, brushing down his horse with methodical strokes. He didn't look up when she approached, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "Jake, I wanted to thank you again." "For everything. No need for thanks. Just glad you're feeling better." His voice was carefully neutral, but Elizabeth could hear the hurt underneath. "Thomas wants to leave within the hour." Jake's hand stilled on the horse's coat for just a moment before resuming its rhythm. Best not to keep him waiting then. Elizabeth wanted to say more, wanted to explain the impossible situation she was in, but how could she? Jake was a good man who deserved someone who could choose him freely, not someone trapped by circumstances and obligations. "Jake, what you started to say earlier before Thomas arrived ... Doesn't matter now." Jake finally looked at her, and Elizabeth saw pain in his eyes that made her chest ache. "You have your life to live, and I have mine. That's just how it is." But it wasn't how Elizabeth wanted it to be, and that realization hit her like a physical blow. Standing there in the afternoon sun, watching this kind, honest man try to hide his feelings to spare her guilt, she understood that she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. The journey to Thomas's ranch passed in uncomfortable silence. Elizabeth rode in Thomas's well-appointed carriage while he pointed out various landmarks and explained his business dealings. He owned thousands of acres and hundreds of cattle, he told her. His house was the finest in the territory, with real glass windows and furniture shipped from back east. "You'll find ranch life quite different from city living," Thomas said as they approached his property. "But I'm sure you'll adapt. I've made it clear to the household staff that you're to be treated with respect. But I do expect you to maintain proper standards. Can't have the men thinking their boss's wife is too familiar with the help." The ranch house was impressive, Elizabeth had to admit. It was large and well built, with a wide porch and carefully tended gardens. But something about it felt cold. To her, like a picture in a magazine rather than a real home. Thomas's housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, was a kind woman who showed Elizabeth to her room and helped her settle in. The room was beautiful, with fine furniture and soft bedding, but Elizabeth felt like she was staying in a hotel rather than coming home. That first evening, Thomas took her on a tour of the property. He was clearly proud of what he had built, and Elizabeth tried to show proper appreciation. But when she asked questions about the cattle or the daily operations, Thomas seemed surprised. "You don't need to worry about the business side of things," he said. "That's men's work. Your job will be managing the household and entertaining guests when necessary. I'll hire a woman from town to teach you the social expectations. Elizabeth bit back her response. In Boston, she had helped run her father's business for years. She was good with numbers and planning, but apparently those skills wouldn't be valued here. The next few days followed a similar pattern. Thomas was polite but distant, treating Elizabeth more like a business arrangement than a future wife. He would discuss ranch business with his foreman for hours, but had little to say to Elizabeth beyond basic pleasantries. Elizabeth tried to make the best of it. She explored the house, attempted to befriend the household staff, and read books from Thomas's surprisingly well-stocked library. But at night, lying in the comfortable but lonely bedroom, she found herself thinking about Jake. She wondered where he was, whether he had joined that cattle drive, whether he ever thought about her. On the third day, Elizabeth made a decision that surprised even herself. After breakfast, she announced to Thomas that she wanted to learn to ride properly, whatever for. Thomas asked, looking up from his morning newspaper. If I'm going to live on a ranch, I should know how to get around independently. Thomas frowned. The carriage is perfectly adequate for your needs. I don't want my wife riding around the countryside like some common cowgirl. Just around the ranch, Elizabeth persisted. Surely that would be acceptable. Reluctantly, Thomas agreed, assigning one of his men to teach her. But when Elizabeth met her instructor at the stables, she was shocked to see it was Jake. What are you doing here? She asked, her heart racing. Jake looked uncomfortable. Needed work for the winter. Thomas hired me on as a hand. Didn't know you were here until this morning. Elizabeth felt a rush of joy followed immediately by panic. Having Jake so close but so out of reach felt like torture. Does Thomas know? You're the one who helped me? Told him I knew you from the boarding house, nothing more. For the next week, Elizabeth's riding lessons became the highlight of her days. Jake was a patient teacher and Elizabeth was a quick learner. More importantly, they were able to talk freely during their rides around the ranch property. Are you happy here? Jake asked one afternoon as they rested their horses by a stream. Elizabeth considered lying, then decided Jake deserved honesty. Uncomfortable. Safe. That's what I wanted, isn't it? Is it? Elizabeth looked at him, this man who had shown her more genuine care in a week than Thomas had in their entire acquaintance. I don't know anymore. Before I met you, I thought comfort and security were enough. Now. Now I understand what I'll be giving up? They sat in silence for a while, watching the water flow past. Finally, Jake spoke. Elizabeth, I have to tell you something, and then I promise I'll never bring it up again. Elizabeth's heart stopped. Jake, don't, please. I love you. I've loved you since that second night when you woke up and smiled at me. I know your promise to Thomas, and I know I have nothing to offer you but hard work and an uncertain future. But I had to say it once. Elizabeth felt tears streaming down her face. Jake. I'm leaving tomorrow. Told Thomas I got word of work elsewhere. I can't stay here and watch you marry him, knowing how I feel. That night, Elizabeth lay awake staring at the ceiling. In less than 24 hours, Jake would be gone forever, and she would be left to build a life with a man she respected but could never love. For the first time since her father's death, she had to decide what kind of future she really wanted. Elizabeth didn't sleep at all that night. She lay in her comfortable bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Jake's words. By dawn, she had made her decision, but it took her 3 more hours to find the courage to act on it. She waited until Thomas left for his morning ride around the property, then quickly packed her few belongings into the same small bag she had arrived with. Her hands were shaking as she folded her dresses, but her mind was clear for the first time in weeks. Mrs. Rodriguez found her in the hallway, bag in hand. Miss Elizabeth? Where are you going? I'm leaving, Mrs. Rodriguez. I can't marry Mr. Whitman. The older woman's eyes widened. But miss, where will you go? What will you do? Elizabeth took a deep breath. I'm going to find the man I love and hope he hasn't left town yet. Mrs. Rodriguez studied her face for a moment, then smiled. Good for you, miss. Life's too short to spend it with the wrong person. Elizabeth made it to the stables without being seen by Thomas or his foreman. She saddled the gentle mare she had been learning to ride, grateful for Jake's patient lessons. Her heart was pounding as she rode away from the ranch, but for the first time in months, she felt like she was moving toward something instead of running away. The ride to Cedar Creek took longer than she expected. Elizabeth was still learning to ride, and she had to stop several times to rest both herself and the horse. By the time she reached the small town, the sun was high overhead and she was exhausted. She tied her horse outside the boarding house and rushed inside, hoping desperately that she wasn't too late. Mrs. Patterson looked up in surprise from her mending. "Elizabeth, child, what are you doing here? I thought you'd gotten married and settled by now. Is Jake still here? Please tell me he hasn't left yet." Mrs. Patterson's face lit up with understanding. "He's at the stables, getting ready to head out. Been moping around here for 3 days like he lost his best friend." Elizabeth ran to the stables, her heart racing. She found Jake loading his saddlebags onto his horse, moving with the slow, methodical movements of a man trying to keep himself busy. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, and the expression on his face went from surprise to concern. "Elizabeth? What are you doing here? Is everything all right?" "No, everything is not all right." Elizabeth stopped in front of him, breathing hard from running. "I can't marry Thomas." Jake went very still. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I can't marry a man I don't love when I'm in love with someone else." Elizabeth's voice was shaking, but she pressed on. "Jake, I know you don't have much to offer in terms of money or security. I know life with you would be hard and uncertain. But I'd rather have 1 year of real happiness with you than 50 years of comfortable misery with Thomas." Jake stared at her like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Elizabeth, you don't know what you're saying. You'd be giving up everything. Security, comfort, respectability. For what? A drifting cowboy who doesn't even own a piece of land. For love. For the chance to build something real with someone who actually sees me as a person, not just a decoration for his house." Elizabeth stepped closer to him. "Jake, when I was sick, you took care of me like I mattered. You listened to me talk about books and dreams like my thoughts were worth something. Thomas looks at me like I'm a prize he won, but you look at me like I single quotes Dyke, I'm home." Jake's resolve was crumbling. "But what about Thomas? He's probably discovered you're gone by now. He'll come looking for you." "Let him come. I'll tell him the truth, that I can't marry him because my heart belongs to someone else." Jake reached out tentatively and touched her face like he was afraid she might disappear. "Are you sure about this? Really sure? Because once we leave here together, there's no going back. People will talk. They'll say things about you. I don't care what people say, I care about being with you." Jake pulled her into his arms then, holding her tight against his chest. Elizabeth could feel his heart beating fast, matching her own. "I love you so much it scares me," he whispered into her hair. "I've been trying to do the right thing, trying to let you go, but I can't. I just can't." "Then don't," Elizabeth said, looking up at him. "We'll figure everything else out as we go." Their first kiss was everything Elizabeth had imagined and more. It was gentle and desperate at the same time, full of all the feelings they had been holding back for weeks. When they finally broke apart, both of them were crying and laughing at the same time. "We should probably get out of town before Thomas shows up," Jake said practically, though he didn't let go of her. "Where will we go?" "I know a preacher about 2 towns over. If you're really sure about this, we could be married by evening." Elizabeth felt a flutter of nerves mixed with excitement. "That fast? Unless you want to wait and have a big wedding with flowers and fancy dresses." Elizabeth thought about the elaborate wedding Thomas had been planning with important guests and expensive everything. Then she looked at Jake, standing in a dusty stable in his work clothes, offering her his heart and his name with nothing but love to recommend him. "I don't need flowers or fancy dresses. I just need you." They were married that evening by Reverend Miller in the small church at Willow Creek. Mrs. Patterson had insisted on coming along as a witness, bringing little Tommy, who was finally feeling better. Elizabeth wore her simple blue traveling dress, and Jake had managed to find a clean shirt and jacket in town. They had no rings, but the Reverend said the words just the same, and when Jake kissed his new wife, Elizabeth felt like the luckiest woman in the world. The news of Elizabeth's departure reached Thomas by late afternoon. He arrived in Cedar Creek with several of his men, looking thunderous, but Elizabeth had anticipated this. She met him on the porch of the boarding house, wearing Jake's jacket over her dress and holding his hand. "Thomas, I owe you an apology." "And an explanation." "You owe me more than that," Thomas said coldly. "You're my intended bride. We had an agreement." "An agreement I should never have made." "I can't marry you, Thomas. I don't love you, and I never will." "You deserve better than that, and so do I." Thomas looked at Jake with undisguised contempt. "This is what you're throwing away your future for a common cowhand?" "This is who I'm choosing to build a life with," Elizabeth said firmly. "Someone who values me for who I am, not what I represent." Thomas was furious, but he wasn't stupid. He could see that Elizabeth's mind was made up, and causing a scene in front of the whole town wouldn't help his reputation. After a few more harsh words, he left with his men. Though Elizabeth knew she had probably made an enemy, Jake and Elizabeth spent their wedding night in the same room where she had been sick, where their love story had really begun. It felt perfect and right, lying in his arms and talking about their plans for the future. "Are you scared?" Jake asked in the darkness. "Terrified," Elizabeth admitted, "but also more excited than I've ever been. What about you?" "Same. I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and find out this was all a dream." "Well, if it is, then we're both having the same dream." They left Cedar Creek the next morning, heading west toward California, where Jake had heard there were opportunities for people willing to work hard and start fresh. Elizabeth had never seen country like they traveled through, vast open spaces that seemed to go on forever, mountains that touched the sky, rivers that ran clear and cold. It wasn't an easy life. They spent their first months living in a one-room cabin Jake built with his own hands, sleeping on a mattress stuffed with pine needles and cooking over an open fire. Elizabeth learned to tend a garden, preserve food for winter, and do washing in the river. Her hands grew rough and her skin darkened from the sun, but she had never been happier. Jake found work on a ranch owned by a kind man who appreciated honest workers. Elizabeth started teaching the ranch owner's children and taking in sewing to earn extra money. Slowly, carefully, they began saving every penny they could. 3 years later, they had enough to buy their own small piece of land, just 40 acres, but it was theirs. Jake raised horses while Elizabeth ran a small school for the local children. They built a real house with glass windows and a front porch where they would sit in the evenings, watching the sunset and planning their future. They had 4 children over the years, each one treasured and loved. Elizabeth taught them all to read and write, while Jake taught them to ride and work with their hands. The children grew up hearing the story of how their parents met, how their mother had fallen sick, and their father had kept watch over her by candlelight, how love had grown from kindness and bloomed into something beautiful. Elizabeth lived to be 78 years old, surrounded by children and grandchildren who adored her. Jake was by her side until the very end, still holding her hand the way he had that first night in Cedar Creek. Their love story became local legend, proof that sometimes the biggest risks lead to the greatest rewards, and that real love is worth more than all the security money can buy.